Mr. President, I rise today to discuss the Senate's failure to meet its constitutional obligation and conduct effective oversight of what seems to me and many others to be this administration's inexorable march toward war with Iran. This week, the New York Times reported that the Trump administration is making plans to deploy 120,000 American troops to the Middle East in anticipation of a confrontation with Iran. It's no secret that some of the president's closest advisors are focused on regime change and possibly military engagement with Iran. I was encouraged by a story in the Washington Post that was posted last night. The headline of that story was read as follows, quote, "Trump, frustrated by advisors, is not convinced the time is right to attack Iran," unquote. That was the headline and the version of the story that I saw reported by four Washington Post reporters. In pertinent part, the story read as follows. It indicated the president thinks his advisors, and now I'm quoting, quote, "could rush the U.S. into a military confrontation with Iran," and then it goes on to further state, and again quoting, "Trump prefers a diplomatic approach to resolving tensions," unquote. So I'm encouraged by that, but we have to be vigilant when it comes to this issue and the broader issue of the use of force. The plans that I mentioned before, referred to by the New York Times, apparently were submitted by Acting Defense Secretary Shanahan. These are the most recent in a string of actions this administration has taken, from withdrawing from the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement, to designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the so-called IRGC, as a foreign terrorist organization, to suspending waivers that allow partner countries to continue importing Iranian oil. I have a long record of working to fight against Iranian aggression. We all know, and we've said it often, we should say it again, Iran is and has been the leading state sponsor of terrorism. So many of us, in a bipartisan way, for years, have led efforts to confront Iran, to sanction Iran, to hold Iran accountable for its malign activity and actions in the Middle East, and its actions to support terrorist organizations, whether it's Hezbollah or any other terrorist organization. So that's bipartisan. We will continue that, regardless of this debate. But when the New York Times talked about that military plan, they referred to a prior engagement, a prior military conflict, the conflict in Iraq. Quote, and I'm quoting the New York Times, "Echoes of Iraq War," was what the Times said. "These echoes trigger memories and reflections of a misguided period of this body's history in which Congress approved the United States invasion of Iraq based upon faulty intelligence. By the end of that long war, thousands of Americans were killed. Many more Americans were wounded. Just in Pennsylvania alone, 197 Pennsylvanians killed in action in the Iraq War. More than 1,200 were wounded. And I haven't even talked about the conflict in Afghanistan, where Pennsylvania lost more than 90. Last number I saw was 91 Pennsylvanians killed in action in Afghanistan. So Pennsylvania is well familiar with contributing fighting men and women to conflicts from the beginning of our republic until this very day. The administration's actions on Iran also echo our ongoing stalemate, and stalemate might be an understatement, regarding the authorization for the use of military force, so-called AUMF, against ISIS, for example. If we don't debate and vote on an AUMF as it relates to Iran or any other country, or any other conflict, we are not doing our job. For 6 years, the United States has been engaged in the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. For many years, the executive branch has relied on the 2001 authorization for the use of military force to justify its fight against ISIS, as well as to justify other military engagements. I asked Majority Leader McConnell to set aside time for sustained debate and votes on a new authorization for the use of military force. Last month, Secretary of State Pompeo implied during testimony in front of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate that the 2001 AUMF to go after al-Qaeda and its affiliates authorizes war with Iran. A lot of people would disagree with that. I believe that an 18-year-old authorization needs an update, another understatement. The threats we confront today have evolved since 2001. As this administration seeks to link al-Qaeda and Iran in anticipation of a military confrontation, I am concerned over bipartisan failure to hold both this and the prior administration to account for its constitutional overreach over congressional authority. I commend Senator Kaine and other senators, and those who for years, sometimes in both parties, for efforts over the last number of years to force a debate and congressional oversight over this issue. The majority leader should allow floor time and a robust debate on congressional war powers and oversight over the executive's unilateral actions that send American troops overseas. The debate on the Yemen resolution and the vote, several votes actually on that, demonstrated that there is bipartisan concern over the use of force. But we need a broader debate than we had in the debate on the Yemen resolution. As this administration pursues a reckless strategy with Iran, it's time for a sustained debate and vote on a new authorization for the use of military force that allows our nation to, in fact, destroy terrorists and fight threats to U.S. national security, but doesn't result in endless war. The 2001 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force, authorizing military action in Iraq and Afghanistan, are outdated and must be replaced. Mr. President, I'll conclude with some words from Abraham Lincoln in that now famous letter to Mrs. Bixby, where he talked about in this letter her loss of her son's lives in the Civil War. Turned out when they did the checks on it to be 2 sons. When the president was writing, he thought she had lost 5 sons. But we still have families that suffer the loss of a son or a daughter in conflict. We hope not as many as 2 or more. But in this case, President Lincoln said, he started in the second paragraph with this line, "The grief of a loss so overwhelming." And then he goes on to say to this grieving mother, "But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom," unquote. So said President Lincoln at that time. And the words still ring true today. The grief of a loss so overwhelming, the memory of the loved and lost, and then goes on to say, so costly a sacrifice. Every president should read this letter as he or she deliberates about the use of force that commits our sons and daughters to fight and risk their lives. When we talk about so costly a sacrifice, we all know what happened in our states. Military families in Pennsylvania, in the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, endured so costly a sacrifice. I hope President Trump will reread that letter as he deliberates our next steps with regard to Iran and our next steps with regard to the authorization for the use of military force. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.